The suburban street was quiet, the kind of peace that could make anyone feel safe. The kind of place where kids played and neighbors waved. It was the kind of place that felt like it could never change. But tonight, something was about to break that illusion. A man in his late 30s stepped out of his house. His name was Daniel, a former cop, now living quietly, trying to enjoy his peace. He was dressed casually, not in uniform, but the way he walked told anyone who cared to watch that he had a presence. He wasn't just another neighbor. His eyes scanned the street. It was normal. But then, something caught his attention. A black car, parked too long in front of his house. The engine was running, but the windows were tinted. Daniel's instincts clicked in. Something wasn't right. His hand brushed the concealed pistol beneath his jacket, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He approached the car slowly, his steps measured, the weight of his experience making him steady. The car door opened. Out stepped a man. Tall. Broad. Wearing a cap low over his eyes. A dark figure in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Daniel didn't move, but his posture changed, his back straightened. The stranger didn't speak. He just stared. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. It was an odd silence. One that seemed to stretch. Daniel broke it first. "Evening," he said. His voice calm, but sharp. The stranger didn't answer, his gaze still locked onto Daniel. He didn't even move. Daniel's hand hovered near his sidearm. The air between them thickened. Then the familiar sound of footsteps broke through the tension. It was Karen. She was the head of the HOA. She had been around for years, always trying to keep things in line. Her voice rang out like a bell, loud and accusing. "What's going on here, Daniel? You think you can just stand around while I try to keep order?" Daniel glanced at her but didn't say a word. She was known for causing trouble, but he didn't have time for that. The stranger's silence was what bothered him most. She marched closer, pointing her finger. "You've been ignoring the rules. You think you can just break them and get away with it? This is my neighborhood." The stranger shifted, slowly reaching into his jacket. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. Something wasn't right here. His instincts screamed at him. Suddenly, the stranger pulled something from his jacket. It was a gun. The barrel gleamed in the sunlight. Daniel's heart raced, but his movements were smooth, deliberate. He kept his hands up, showing no fear. But inside, every nerve was alive, every muscle tensed. The crowd of neighbors that had gathered began to whisper, but their voices were drowned out by the deafening silence of the moment. Karen's eyes darted between the man with the gun and Daniel. "You're going to do something about this? You let him threaten me?" Daniel didn't flinch. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Put the gun down." For a moment, Karen hesitated. Her grip on the gun tightened, her breath quickening. But Daniel's presence was commanding. He wasn't going to let this escalate further. His voice dropped, calm but firm. "Put it down, now." The tension hung in the air. The stranger's eyes flickered toward Karen, then back to Daniel. It was clear, he wasn't just here for a neighborhood dispute. He had come with intent. And that intent wasn't something Daniel was going to let slide. The pistol was still aimed at Daniel, but the stranger's hand wavered slightly. His fingers trembled just enough to betray the tension in his body. Karen, standing beside him, looked ready to erupt, but Daniel's presence held her in check. The gun pointed toward him, but his voice remained steady, like the calm before the storm. "You're making a mistake," Daniel said, his voice firm. His body remained loose, but every muscle was prepared for what could happen next. The stranger's eyes flickered toward Karen. It was subtle, but it was enough for Daniel to catch. Something wasn't right here. Karen stepped forward, her hand still clutching the clipboard. You think you're the law here? She snapped. We have rules. You can't just ignore them. Daniel glanced at her, then back at the man with the gun. His gaze was sharp, calculating. You've made a big mistake, Karen. He's not what you think he is. Karen's confusion only lasted a moment before she broke into a laugh. What are you talking about? He's here to make sure you follow the rules, just like I said. But Daniel wasn't listening to her anymore. His instincts were on high alert. Something about the way the stranger held himself didn't sit right. The man wasn't nervous. He wasn't sweating, despite the intensity of the situation. He was calculating. Who are you? Daniel asked, his voice low but commanding. The stranger stiffened, his hand tightening around the gun. Karen's expression faltered for a brief moment as if she had realized something was slipping out of her control. Answer me, Daniel pressed, his voice sharp, the threat clear in his tone. Who are you really? The silence between them stretched long, the weight of Daniel's words hanging in the air. And for a moment, the stranger did nothing but stare at him, his hand still on the pistol. Then, finally, the man's lips curled into a thin, tense smile. You're asking the wrong questions, he said quietly, the words laced with a hint of menace. At that moment, Daniel's eyes narrowed. Everything about this situation screamed wrong. The badge, the way he held the gun, it wasn't right. It was too stiff. Too rehearsed. Too fake. Daniel stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, making sure his presence was felt. You're not a cop, he said, more certain now than ever before. And neither is she. Karen's eyes widened. The realization hit her just a split second too late. What? What are you talking about? She stammered, her voice faltering for the first time. The stranger's smile faded. He took a step back, reaching inside his jacket again. Daniel didn't flinch. He could already guess what was coming. Just as the man moved his hand, Daniel spoke, his voice full of authority, "Don't make this worse. Drop it." The stranger froze. His hand was still reaching, but he hesitated, long enough for Daniel to make his move. The sirens were getting closer now, the wail of the police cars ringing through the air. The crowd that had gathered around them stood even farther back, eyes wide, glued to the scene. No one dared to speak. Daniel's focus never left the man. This was the moment. If he acted too soon, the situation could escalate. If he waited too long, it could be too late. With the sirens still growing louder, the stranger's hand fell away from his jacket. Slowly, he backed up, his eyes darting nervously toward Karen. But Karen wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were locked on Daniel. Her betrayal was clear, and in that moment, everything changed. Daniel exhaled slowly, but he didn't relax. Not yet. The sirens were deafening now, echoing off the houses and bouncing down the quiet street. The crowd, once standing in shocked silence, now shuffled nervously, whispers filling the air. The situation had gone from a neighborhood argument to a standoff in a matter of moments. Daniel's eyes never left the stranger. The gun was still in the man's hand, but now there was a hesitation, a flicker of doubt. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't even close. Put it down, Daniel said again, his voice steady but sharp. You're not a cop, and I know it. The man shifted his stance, his eyes darting around the growing crowd. Daniel could see the panic rising. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't ready to be exposed. The stranger glanced toward Karen, her face pale, her fingers twitching as if she were going to intervene. But she didn't. Not now. She knew this was beyond her. The sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the real police, and the stranger's eyes flickered once more, this time toward the street corner. His hand tightened around the pistol, but he didn't make a move. Daniel's heart raced. He wasn't sure what this man was capable of, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to stay in control. The real officers would be here in seconds. This would be over soon, but not before he made sure that the fake officer knew he had no room to maneuver. "Step away from the gun," Daniel ordered, his voice low. The man hesitated for a moment, his expression shifting from arrogance to panic. He took a slow, deliberate step back, his eyes shifting between Daniel and the approaching sirens. It was then that the full scope of the situation hit Daniel. Karen had orchestrated this, brought him here, to her neighborhood. But why? What was the endgame? Before he could answer his own questions, the screech of tires filled the air. A police cruiser skidded to a halt at the edge of the block, followed by two more, their lights flashing in rapid succession. The officers were out of their cars in seconds, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the scene. One officer stepped forward, his gaze moving from Daniel to the stranger. "Put the weapon down," the officer commanded, his voice steady and firm. The stranger froze, his grip on the pistol tightening once again, but this time, the real authority had arrived. The lie he'd built around himself began to crumble under the weight of the truth. "Now!" the officer barked. The stranger's eyes flicked toward Karen, his last ally, but she didn't speak. She was silent, her face flushed with panic, realizing too late that she had crossed a line. With one final, reluctant movement, the stranger dropped the gun onto the pavement. The metallic clink echoed across the street. The sound of the gun hitting the ground reverberated in the stillness of the street. Karen's face drained of color as the truth slowly dawned on her. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. This was something far darker. The stranger's eyes locked on Daniel, full of rage and frustration. He wasn't going down without a fight. The police officers closed in, and the tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. One officer stepped forward, his weapon still aimed at the stranger. "Put your hands behind your head. Now!" The man didn't move. His eyes flickered to Karen again, but this time, she didn't offer any support. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, realizing that everything she had been fighting for, everything she had worked so hard to control, was crumbling around her. "Move," the officer commanded. "Hands behind your head." The stranger slowly, reluctantly, obeyed, his movements stiff, betraying his anger. Daniel watched carefully, every muscle tensed, ready to react at the slightest change. Karen, meanwhile, stood to the side, trying to gather her composure. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She wanted to explain herself, to justify the mess she had created. But it was too late. Her actions had spoken louder than any words she could muster. The officers moved in quickly, securing the man in handcuffs. He struggled briefly, but there was no fight left in him. One officer cuffed him tightly, pulling his arms behind his back. Another officer stepped forward, inspecting the gun on the ground, carefully picking it up with gloved hands. Daniel watched the entire process unfold before him. His heart was still pounding, but the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. The realization of what had just happened, how close he had come to being caught in the chaos, was sinking in. Karen's face flushed with shame, and she quickly looked away. The weight of the situation finally hit her. The lies she had told, the fear she had instilled in the neighborhood, it was all coming back to her now. There was no hiding anymore. Daniel watched her with a mix of disappointment and something colder, something darker. She had pushed the boundaries too far. Now, the community would be left to deal with the aftermath of her decisions. The quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder as the officers escorted the man toward the squad car, his hands bound behind his back. The flashing lights illuminated their faces in sharp contrast, adding to the chaos that had unfolded in what was supposed to be a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Daniel stood silently, watching the scene unfold. The weight of the situation had begun to sink in, but the real work wasn't done yet. The man had been arrested, but there was still Karen to deal with. She had played a part in all of this, and Daniel knew it wasn't over. As the police car doors slammed shut, Karen stepped forward, her expression a mixture of shame and defiance. She had been silent since her earlier outburst, but now she was ready to explain herself. Her voice wavered slightly, but she forced the words out. "I didn't know," she said, trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. "He told me he was a former officer. I thought he was helping." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on her. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Karen. Don't act like you didn't." The neighbors, who had been watching from the sidelines, were starting to gather around. Some murmured in disbelief, others stood in shock. Everyone had their own version of the story. But Daniel had seen enough. He had known from the start that something wasn't right, and now, with the fake officer in custody, he needed to get to the truth. Karen took a step forward, her face tight with frustration. "I was trying to keep the neighborhood safe. You've seen how things have been going downhill. Fines, violations, people don't care about the rules anymore. Someone had to do something, Daniel." Her voice was rising, as if she had to convince herself just as much as the others. "Safe?" Daniel's voice was cold, his expression unchanging. "You think using a fake cop and threatening people with a gun is the way to keep the neighborhood safe?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of her actions hit her then, and for the first time, she realized the depth of the mess she had caused. She had become so obsessed with controlling the neighborhood, with enforcing rules at any cost, that she had turned to desperate measures. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her eyes lowered. I thought if I could just enforce the rules, everything would be fine." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You crossed a line, Karen. You brought someone in, someone dangerous, to do your dirty work. And now look where we are." Behind them, an officer walked up, holding the gun that had once been pointed at Daniel. The officer examined it carefully before turning it over to Daniel. The cold, metal weight was a stark reminder of how close things had come to escalating into something far worse. "The weapon was loaded," the officer said, his voice grim. "We found it in his jacket along with a false ID. This guy wasn't just playing cop. He was involved in something much bigger. He's part of a criminal network that's been posing as law enforcement." Daniel felt a chill run through him. The story wasn't just about Karen's obsession with HOA rules, it was about a much larger issue that had somehow found its way into their neighborhood. He had suspected it all along. The fake officer wasn't just some random hire, he was part of something darker, something more dangerous. Karen's face had gone ashen. She stepped back, her hands trembling. I didn't know he was involved in all that. I just wanted things to be in order." Her voice cracked, and for a brief moment, she seemed small, fragile even. But Daniel wasn't buying it. He had seen people like Karen before, those who believed they were doing the right thing, but whose actions led to chaos. The road to hell, they said, was paved with good intentions. And Karen's road had just led them all straight into a nightmare. "You wanted control," Daniel said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "But control comes with consequences. And now, you're going to face those consequences." The police officers who had arrived to back him up began to move, taking Karen into custody. She didn't resist. Her shoulders sagged, and her eyes stayed down, the weight of her actions sinking in. As she was led away, Daniel stayed behind, watching the scene. The neighbors were still watching him, some with gratitude, others with suspicion. But it didn't matter. The truth was out. And the damage had already been done. Daniel turned to face the street, his thoughts already racing to what would happen next. Karen's obsession with rules had led her to make a choice that no one would forget. And as the police cars pulled away, Daniel knew that things in the neighborhood would never be the same. The street was quiet again, but not the same quiet it had been before. This silence was heavier, filled with the weight of what had just happened. Neighbors returned to their homes, each one in their own world, trying to make sense of the events they had just witnessed. But Daniel stood still, his eyes scanning the street. The neighborhood would never be the same. Karen was gone, taken into custody. The fake officer, now under arrest, had been exposed as part of a larger criminal network. The gun, the lies, the threats, all of it had been unmasked. But the question still lingered in the air. How far did the corruption run? And what would happen now? As the police finished their reports, Daniel felt the familiar tug of his duty. His heart, still pounding from the standoff, was slowing now, but his mind was racing. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't walk away from a mess like this and pretend everything would be okay. "Daniel," came a voice from behind him. He turned to find one of the officers walking toward him, a solemn look on his face. "You did good," the officer said, nodding in Daniel's direction. "You kept things from getting worse." Daniel didn't smile. "I wish I'd done more." The officer gave a small shrug. "We all do. But you handled yourself. You didn't let the situation escalate. That takes a lot of control." "Control," Daniel muttered, looking down the quiet street. That's what it's always been about for her. Control over everything. Over people. Over the neighborhood. The officer said nothing, but Daniel could see he understood. "We're still trying to piece everything together," the officer continued, his voice steady but low. "There are more people involved than just the two we've arrested. This whole thing runs deeper than anyone realized." Daniel nodded. He had suspected as much. He had seen the cracks before, but he never thought they would run this deep. "We'll keep you in the loop, of course," the officer added. "But you did the right thing today. You saved a lot of people from a whole lot of trouble." Daniel took a slow breath. The weight of the day was starting to settle into his bones. But he wasn't done yet. He couldn't walk away until he had the full picture. Until he knew everything that had been happening under the surface of this quiet neighborhood. "I'm not done here," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "I'll be around. If there's more to uncover, I'll find it." The officer nodded, respecting his determination. "I'm sure you will. You always do." As the officer walked away, Daniel turned back to the street. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows on the quiet houses. The last of the police cars pulled away, the flashing lights fading into the distance. Daniel remained, standing in the stillness. This wasn't just about one bad apple or one corrupt individual. This was about something bigger. Something that threatened everything he had once thought safe. He knew it wasn't over. He knew there were more stories to uncover, more truths to reveal. The neighborhood might have returned to its quiet, suburban life, but Daniel's work was just beginning.